Lawrence Price. Good morning. All right, there you are, and here I am. I'm Rich Holshoe, your moderator for today, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Monadnock Summer Lyceum with today's guest speaker, Professor Robert Goodby. Before we get started, I'd like to thank today's musician, Virginia Eskin, for providing the music. Which many of you enjoyed while waiting for the presentation to begin. And I also would like to thank the Putnam Foundation for generously sponsoring today's event, and DeCall's Garden Center for the beautiful flowers. For many years, the Monadnock Summer Lyceum has brought outstanding world-class speakers to the Monadnock region to serve as catalysts to inform, engage, and inspire an active citizenry on local, national, and global issues. Today's talk is being recorded and will soon be available as a podcast and as a video on our website, monadnocklyceum.org. Programs are rebroadcast on WSMN 1590 AM the following Sunday at 10 a.m. and on WUML 91.5 FM the following Wednesday at 11 a.m. and the following Sunday at 3 p.m. As is the tradition of the Lyceum, after the presentation, our speaker will answer questions from the audience. Those present in the meeting house may write your questions on the yellow cards in the pew in front of you, and an usher will come around to collect them. And for those watching virtually, please submit your questions by using the chat space on YouTube. The Monadnock Summer Lyceum is supported entirely through contributions from our audience members. We deeply appreciate your donations, which may be placed in the glass bowls in the church and in the parish hall. Those listening at home may make contributions on the website or by mailing your donation. Thank you for your generous support. In your pew, you will find a green card. We hope you will give us feedback on today's program and join our mailing list and/or our email list. You can either mail the green card to us or drop it in the bowls alone or with your contribution to the sustainability of the Monadnock Lyceum. For those watching virtually, you may provide feedback on today's program, suggestions for our next summer speaker, make a donation, or join our mailing list through the website. Following the program, we invite you to attend an informal reception in the parish hall through the door to my right. Now to the business at hand. Our speaker today is Dr. Robert Goodby of Franklin Pierce University, centered nearby in Rindge, New Hampshire, where he is professor of anthropology and archaeology. Dr. Goodby is the recently published author of A Deep Presence, 13,000 Years of Native American History, issued with the support of the Harris Center for Conservation Education and the Historical Society of Cheshire County. With accounts drawn from his over 30 years of archaeological inquiries here in what we now refer to as New England, the book is an intriguing, insightful, and inviting portrayal of living stories from deep time through the present, documenting human relationships with this immediate landscape. His words make it clear that all of these things are still here to be known, and they inform who we are today. And they ask us the question, how does this change our own relationship and response now that we understand better? I know Dr. Goodby as a good friend and colleague. I am honored that he requested that I serve as moderator today. I call him Bob. Hi, Bob. And I have worked with him on several projects, and I value both his professional insight and the empathy for the contemporary Indigenous people that accompany it. It is in this context that I have come to know Bob through my own full-time work with the Atawi Project, based in Wantastagok, which you know as Brattleboro, which is a nonprofit dedicated to raising public awareness of lasting Abenaki relationships in this immediate area and to supporting today's descendant communities. He is a trusted source, an advocate, an ally, an interlocutor, and I'm happy to introduce him to you now. So I say to you, in the language of this land. Kuli payo liu lal damana. Please welcome and enjoy the company of our guest today, Dr. Bob Goodby.
Thank you. Good morning. This is my first time speaking from a pulpit, so I will get used to it eventually. So thank you, Rich, and thank you to the folks who have organized the Lyceum series. So here we are, in a beautiful building that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places in the center of downtown Peterborough. And I'm an archaeologist. And the last couple of years, as we have been locked down with COVID, we have all had to adjust our lives. And my wife and I live in the next town over, and one of the things we got into a habit of doing was coming into Peterborough when we just had to get out of the house and getting some takeout food because that's all you could do. And behind the toadstool, there is a little park with a single picnic table, and we would go there, and we would sit, and we would eat. And every time we did that, my poor, long-suffering wife would hear me say the same thing, because I'd be sitting there, and I'd be looking at this location where the Nubanuset River comes into the Contoocook River, and looking at the flat terrain, the unusually flat terrain that we have right here in downtown Peterborough, and saying to her again and again and again, there had to have been an amazing Native American site here, because this is just the kind of place that the Native people would have liked to live. It's a good place. And here in the Monadnock region, we are in the southern part of Indakina, the traditional homeland of the Western Abenaki people. And there are a number of things that make it a good place, where we are right here in this building. The confluence of the rivers is a big thing. It's like being at the juncture of two main roads. The flat terrain and the soil. The geologists say what's under our feet here is something they call Adams sandy loam, which is a very well-drained glacial outwash soil, so that when it rains, the water just goes right through it. An ideal place for people to camp. And yet, as we were sitting there at the picnic table, having our meal, and I was enthusing, I was also thinking about the railroad that came through that spot in the 1860s, and I was looking at the sewer pipes and the foundations of the modern buildings, and thinking that in all likelihood, there's absolutely nothing left of the native site that was here. And so how, as an archaeologist, do you begin to write that history? We have a lot of challenges when it comes to using archaeology to write a history that involves human beings and that gives you a real sense for the character and the flavor of people's lives. And part of our problem is we deal with objects that don't speak to us directly, that tell us some important things about people, but also miss some other things, miss some other aspects of human life. And I always wonder what we could see if we could see people in person. So I would like to read you. Picture yourself being here 5,000 years ago, and we actually have a carbon date from a site up on the Nubanuset from 5,000 years ago. We know Native people were here. But picture yourself in this spot 5,000 years ago, and what might you see from here? Okay? I think it would be forested. I think you would see that you were on the edge of a community camped at the mouth of the Nubanuset. Looking at it from a bird's eye view, you could see wigwams, dugout or birch bark canoes. You could see smoke spiraling from fires. You would see men, women, children, dogs. You would hear the sound of the pounding of pestles as nuts are ground into meal. You would hear people laughing and crying. You'd hear the sounds of a human community. And you'd realize that these people are both like and unlike you. And you might be struck by some of the differences, their hair, their skin, their eyes, the shape of their houses. But as you zoom in closer, it would become both more and less familiar. You'd see people working together. You'd see older children caring for younger children. You might see a young man whose long, black, shiny hair is carefully adorned with the shell beads that he collected on his trip to visit relatives along the ocean last summer. You might see a thin old man with cloudy eyes, thinking that he's already made his last trip to the ocean, looking thoughtfully at the young man. You'd hear singing as a small group of people started to paddle up the Nubanussit to a marsh where they would spend the day trapping, fishing, and gathering medicinal plants. You might see a young woman who will be giving birth soon, whose inward-looking expression hides the thoughts of the baby she lost 2 summers before. Now you see people with complex, interesting lives that you can understand and appreciate all the things that you share with them. And then if you zoom out again and zoom back 5,000 years in time, and you see an archaeologist sitting there with his wife and wondering, how do you use this to tell a human story? And so that's what I want to try to do today. I want to talk about what the archaeology has told us about the first inhabitants of this region and some of the things we can do to make this part of a shared human history in this place. So what does the archaeology show us? It shows us quite a bit, a lot more than we knew 30 years ago. One of the things it shows us is that there is a depth to the human presence here. One of the best sites I've ever excavated was in Keene, and I know many of you have heard of it. It's a site from what we call the Paleo-Indian period, and it is the oldest dated archaeological site in all of New England. We have a radiocarbon date from 12,600 years before present, at a time when we know, also from radiocarbon dating, that there were still mammoths and mastodons here in New England. These people came into this area at a time of rapid climate change, encountering brutal, cold, windy conditions of a period the geologists call the Younger Dryas, when the winds were so powerful they actually sculpted sand dunes that geologists can still see today. They came into a world that has no counterpart anywhere on the planet. You can't go anywhere and see the environment they inhabited because it was cold and it was close to the glaciers, but it was so far south that they got more sunlight than any place in the northern latitudes today. It was a world that no longer exists, but archaeology can give us some insight into it. And what we have at this site in Keene are the locations where 4 families had built tents and spent the winter there. And then leaving in the spring, took down their tents and leaving behind a tent-shaped cluster of all their debris, with the ability for us to, in a sense, walk into their houses and ask all kinds of nosy questions. That's a long history in a region where most of the towns are thinking about celebrating maybe their 200th or 250th anniversary. The archaeology also shows us that there is a breadth to the native presence here. Most folks, if they hear about a native site being discovered, think, wow, that's rare and unusual. And it might be in some sense, but there were actually quite a few of these sites. People were here for a long time. There are more of them than we realize. They're all around us. I got a sense of this about 25 years ago when the Army Corps of Engineers that manages the McDowell Reservoir here in Peterborough decided that as part of their responsibilities, they needed to know about cultural resources along the reservoir and in the impoundment of the Nubanussit River. So they hired an archaeological firm to do some survey to see if there were any sites there. And doing the most minimal, bare bones amount of survey, a few little test pits here, a few little test pits there, they found 7 Native American sites just within the impoundment area of the reservoir. After working for years out on the Connecticut River or on the Ashwillet River in Swansea, a few years ago with my students at Franklin Pierce, I decided to focus on the area right around campus, which is an interesting place. It's where sort of the headwaters of the Merrimack River drainage and the Connecticut River drainage butt up against each other so that people traveling by canoe between those 2 places might naturally cross there, but we knew nothing about the native history here. And I got permission from a private landowner and from the towns of Ringe and Jaffrey to test at 4 little locations along the lake. And again, with a minimal level of effort, we found native sites at all 4 locations. So there's a very, very rich history here. The archaeology shows us that there is continuity, that there is a deep attachment that the native people had and have to this place. One of the areas I've worked is out in Swansea, in the area around Sawyer's Crossing, which has a remarkable archaeological record that starts during what we call the Paleo-Indian period, 12,000 years ago. And if you look at the collections in the Swansea Historical Association, there are artifacts from all time periods from that point on forth. And it's a place where the history books tell us that in the 1700s, as their homeland was being invaded and becoming a bloody frontier, it's where the Abenaki chose to build a fort. There's a dam there in the Ashuelot River, a large V-shaped dam built of stones that the first settlers saw and called the Old Indian Fish Dam, used for trapping migratory fish. And we were able to show that the dam was first constructed about 4,000 years ago. But the Europeans didn't see this. They saw native people who didn't seem to be anchored, who didn't seem to be attached, because they wouldn't spend all year in one place. They would leave and then come back later on. And they saw that as a mark of impermanence, but it's not, because they kept coming back to the same places year after year and generation after generation, in some cases for 12,000 or more years. There is, in the archaeology, the more we study and the more we see, there is no evidence that at any time this region was abandoned by the native people. There is no evidence for an incursion of other people from outside who drove out the indigenous population. It's a record of remarkable continuity. And in that sense, those people who were living at the Paleo-Indian site in Keene 12,600 years ago, I think were very likely the ancestors of today's Abenaki people. So it really is a remarkable story. The archaeology also shows that there's a story here, a narrative, a chronology. Oftentimes folks will ask me something like, well, how did the native people bury their dead before the Europeans got here? It's an interesting question, but there isn't one answer to it. If people were here for 12,000 years, there was in that 12,000 years as much change, as much dynamism as you're going to see in the history of any people. So there isn't one answer to that question. There's a story that you have to tell. And that story begins with the end of the Pleistocene. It begins with the retreat of the glaciers. It begins with people adapting to incredible climate change, facing dangerous animals, dealing with brutal cold. And then in the archaeology, we see other changes dimly reflected in differences in where people are settling, differences in artifact styles, patterns that we are really good at documenting but not so good at explaining. We know at some point the bow and arrow replaces the spear as the main hunting weapon, but we don't know for sure when or why. We know that about 3,000 years ago, clay pots begin to be made, but we only have theories as to why that happens. Okay? And we know how the forms and decorations of different tools change through time, but we're not sure why. We know that the corn and beans and squash that the English wrote so much about when they saw native people planting them, we know those begin to be used here about 800 AD or so, okay? And just as a supplement to the existing economy. But again, we don't know why. The archaeology also shows that there are broad connections. The native people of this region were never isolated. It's tempting to think of Stone Age hunting and gathering people as living in a very small world, but the archaeology tells us just the opposite. The world of these people was large and it was complicated. Again, going back to that really early site in Keene, the oldest dated one in New England, the people at that site were making and using stone tools of very high quality stone, and it wasn't coming from this region. It was coming from quarries in northern New Hampshire on the backside of the White Mountains or from north central Maine. And somehow more than 12,000 years ago, making its way through social networks all the way down here. That same stone is sometimes found as far south as New Jersey, to give you a sense of the complexity of these networks. From about 10,000 to maybe 6,000 years ago, people are using more local resources, but you see a remarkable similarity in the styles of their tools from Maine all the way down the Atlantic seaboard to Georgia. Commonly shared artifact styles that all people in this region are using. And then after about 6,000 years ago, that shifts. And the commonalities, instead of going down the seaboard, they head west. And we see similarities from the Great Lakes into New England. We can see these patterns, but we don't know why. But we do know that they show these connections. They show the big world of the native people who were here. That fish dam in Swansea that I mentioned, when I first saw it, I said, because we hadn't really seen anything like this in New England, I said, well, this is remarkable. But it turns out it's not that remarkable, because native people in other parts of North America, from the mid-Atlantic all the way down to Alabama, were making the same kinds of dams. Once again, the people here are part of a very large world. We see connections with the Midwestern mound-building cultures from 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. We see artifacts, tube pipes, and beautifully made stone tools coming made of stone from Ohio, showing up in cemeteries in northwestern Vermont. The connections here are extensive. And even here in Peterborough, we see these. Now, the site that would have been where we are right now is mostly, maybe entirely destroyed. I try not to think about it. But if we're to understand the people who were here, we've got to go up the Nubanuset and look at some of those sites that were discovered by the Army Corps of Engineers. And we excavated one of them, a little site on a knoll overlooking a wetland, the kind of place where people might spend an afternoon. And we found tools, we found the remains of turtles and beaver, and some of the tools were made of stone coming from the Hudson River Valley and from central Vermont and from quarry sources on the Maine-New Hampshire border up around the towns of Ossipee and Tamworth. So as much as 5,000 years ago, the people here in Peterborough were also living in those very big worlds. The archaeology also shows us a story not just of continuity, but it leads us into a remarkable story of survival. Things become very difficult for the native people in the 16th and 17th centuries with the arrival of the Europeans. And we see this reflected in all sorts of ways, some of it in the archaeological record, some of it in the historical record. One of the defining facts of New England history, although many people aren't aware of it, is that a few years before the Pilgrims come here to establish that toehold, there is an epidemic that comes over from Europe, some disease of European origin that the native people were not resistant to. And in the years 1616 to 1617, that disease sweeps from southern New England all the way through New Hampshire and all the way through Maine, killing 90 to 95% of everybody, and paving the way for the English conquest of this area. We can see some reflections of that in the archaeology. We have a few sites here in the Monadnock region from that time period. The site of Fort Hill in Hinsdale is a remarkable site, occupied only for a year, from 1663 to 1664, has an interesting mix of traditional native artifacts and European artifacts that the natives have acquired because they are part of the international trade that's developing in things like beaver furs. But one of the fascinating things about that site is where it is. It's not on the edge of the river, like so many sites. It's set back from the river, and it's on a very unusual geological feature, a high mound, almost like a mesa, steep-sided on every side with a flat top. A really defensible location, and it is the only site that I've seen in this area for 12,000 years where native people felt like they had to be in a defensible location. The archaeology can give us a background for understanding the historic period here, and it is a difficult one. So here we are in Peterborough. A prerequisite for Peterborough to be, for any of the towns here to be, was the removal of the native people. Disease certainly helped, but there were also intentional policies that encouraged the extermination of Native Americans here. It's a difficult history. And we're told now by the New Hampshire legislature and our governor that we're not supposed to introduce divisive concepts into our schools. Well, I'm going to introduce a divisive concept. The extermination of the Native people here was part of deliberate public policy. And one of the ways you see that reflected in the 17th and 18th century is through scalp bounties that were offered for the scalps of Native Americans, so that during the French and Indian Wars, you could get as much as 50 pounds, which was a lot of money back then, 50 pounds for the scalp of an Abenaki man. Lesser amounts for the scalps of women and children. Okay? And at the height of this, okay, in 1755, the New Hampshire legislature, for a short period, actually offered up a scalp bounty of 250 pounds per scalp. To give you a comparison, I rummaged around in some of the history. In 1761, okay, a few years after that scalp bounty, the town of Peterborough voted 68 pounds be spent for the repair of the meeting house and to purchase the land it stood on. Okay? 250 pounds is a lot of money. And that has to happen before these towns can come about. Now, as those wars wind down, the Abenaki seem to fade from history and fade from the archaeological record. If you could have seen an Abenaki person in Peterborough in 1780, they would have been carrying a flintlock musket, not a bow and arrow. They would have been dressed in clothes that would be made perhaps of a lot of European cloth, and they would have carried metal tools. It becomes harder and harder to see them in the archaeological record. So you have to look in the historical record. And then it's still hard to see because the Abenaki were surviving by hiding their native identity, by not standing out. And you see them appear from time to time doing occupations like basket making, a very traditional Abenaki occupation. You see Abenaki women serving as doctresses or healers for isolated rural communities in New England. And they're often not even identified as Abenaki or Indians, they're identified as gypsies, and they're just sort of dimly there on the edges of history. And you keep running into it, though, if you're looking for it. I was reading a book a while ago on Native American baskets of the northeastern woodlands, a general book, and I'm sort of flipping through the book, looking at the pictures and reading the text and things like that, and I come on this postcard from the early 20th century, and the postcard says, Indian basket maker at the Eastern States Packaging Company, and there is a man making a basket in this industrial setting. The Eastern States Packaging Company was here. It was in Peterborough. And that industry, leading up to the Peterborough Basket Company, we had basket making going on in Keene. That was in large part drawn from the native experience. One of the remarkable stories in this region is the story of the Sedekis family in Keene. Israel Sedekis and his wife Mary were Abenaki people who were living in the Abenaki community in Odanak up in Quebec, and in the 1880s decided to move. Life was hard. They were looking for a better life. And they came down the Connecticut River in a canoe and ended up settling in, of all places, Keene, New Hampshire, where they did well. They raised a large family. They became well-liked and prominent members of the community. Israel Sedekis was a deacon of the Episcopal Church. He made a living making baskets and using traditional Abenaki skills to make ash splints, to cane chairs, and things of this sort. It's really a remarkable story. But even in the late 19th and into the 20th century, there were struggles here with the acceptance of Native people, and even with the acceptance of the Sedekis family. There was good old-fashioned racism that had been going on for a long time. One anecdote, and this is from a wonderful book called Woven Through the Sweetgrass, which is assembled by the Sedekis family, a collection of stories about their family's experience in Keene. I'll just read this one briefly. This is about Margaret Sedekis, one of the 12 Sedekis children. And one of the things Margaret did was she was a milliner. She established a millinery shop right off the square in downtown Keene. But here's a story from her childhood. Margaret, my mother's sister, was born in 1890, the fifth of the 8 surviving children of Israel and Mary Sedekis. While she was still in grade school, she went to live in the household of the local doctor as a domestic worker, chosen over her sisters because, as the doctor said while he looked over the girls, he would take the one with the lightest skin. She received no pay, only room and board. Her duties began in the morning when she served and cleaned up at breakfast before she could leave for school. Often, to avoid being tardy, she ran from the house with her hands still wet from washing up the family dishes. As a result, she suffered from severely chapped, cracked hands during the winter months. Fortunately, her father observed the condition of her hands on the occasion of a visit home and ended her employment in the doctor's household. There are other things about the Sedekis family that echo these themes. They were not isolated. In his basket making, Israel Sedekis routinely made trips back up to Odenak to collect supplies and tools and other sorts of materials. Those connections persisted. But there was still uneasiness about the presence of Native people here, about the presence of Indian people. And one of the phenomenal things is that on the birth certificates of the youngest of the Sedekis children, there's this remarkable thing where both of the parents in the category where it identifies their race, both Israel and his wife Mary are identified as Indian in terms of their race, and yet their children are identified as white. And the family story is that that was done intentionally by the folks at the hospital who liked the Sedekis so well, they assumed they were doing them a favor by stripping that away from them. You see a similar sort of ambivalence and conflict when you look at the birth certificates. And I went and looked at some of the other records, including the census records for the Sedekis family. The census records tell a very interesting story. In 1900, when the census taker came along and listed all the members of the family, they were all identified in the term that said race. They were all identified as Indian. 1910, they were all identified as white. And if you look at the form, you see the little very neatly written it says W. And then each one of those, they were a big family, each one of those is crossed out in the same hand, and the abbreviation Indian is written over it. And then in 1920, they're all identified as white. And this bothered the family. The last of the census records I was able to see was from 1930. And it was, I saw this when the census taker came to the home of Israel Sedekis Jr., okay, the Israel Sr.'s son. And that is a remarkable document because instead of the typical standard racial categories used on the census, I've never seen anything like this, where you're supposed to put in a standard term for race. Somebody had written full-blood Abenaki. Okay? And I have this image of Israel, who's a rather serious-looking fellow in the pictures I've seen of him. I have an image of Israel standing over the census taker and saying, "This is what you're going to write." And indeed, that's what appeared in 1930. 7 years later, Israel Jr. died of bronchial pneumonia, and his death certificate identifies him as white. Okay. It becomes harder and harder to see Native people in this region. And sometimes when you do, there are questions about authenticity. Some of the few Abenaki people who were sort of openly Native and were making a living selling and making baskets, people like Louis Watso up on Lake Sunapee or Steve Laurent up in Intervale, when you see pictures of them, they're often adorned with an elaborate feathered headdress, the kind that you saw being worn by Plains Indians, the stereotypical Hollywood Indians. And they were doing that because they wanted to make a statement. They wanted to assert, we are Native people. Okay? We're Indians. And yet some people would look at that and say, well, that's not real. That's not authentic because that's not Abenaki. That's not your culture. This is just a put on. But again, if you go back more than 12,000 years ago, you can see it is real. Because the native people here have always had those connections. They have always drawn things from native communities in other parts of the world. Okay? One of the things that has become very interesting, very challenging for archaeologists is we have, and it used to be that we thought we never had to deal with native people, okay? We just do archaeology however we saw it. But there had been a long-standing conflict between native people and archaeologists over the treatment of Native American burials. Because archaeologists, recognizing burials as a remarkable source of scientific information, had always felt free to dig them up and study them and do whatever we wanted to with them. But with very few exceptions, native people saw this practice as abhorrent and wanted it stopped. The actual record of the digging up of Indian burials, one of the first recorded accounts of that is from the Pilgrims. Before they even landed at Plymouth, they were digging up native burials on Cape Cod. And then in the 19th and 20th century, archaeologists begin doing it wholesale. Okay? And that continues until the 1990s. In the 1960s, when the sort of modern Native American civil rights movement gets started, this is a big issue. And Native people are agitating for protection of their burial sites and for the return of their ancestral remains from the sites where they have been dug up. And finally, in 1990, Congress passes the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and this dramatically changes archaeology. One of the things it does is it says that every museum, and that includes universities, colleges, etc., has to provide Native communities with a list of human remains and sacred items that they have so that they can ask for the return of them. And if they want them given back, they have to be given back. And so, for the first time in our history as a discipline, archaeologists have to talk with Indians. Okay? I remember the first time I did this, I was scared. Okay? But it turns out that in many cases, this is the beginning of really productive, collaborative relationships where both sides can learn from each other and appreciate the common interests that we have, the common appreciation of Native history as a significant thing. But NAGPRA is a funny law. Okay? And one of the things NAGPRA does is it says that this applies to Native American tribes, and a tribe is defined as a group that is federally recognized. Okay? And how many federally recognized Native groups do we have in New Hampshire and Vermont? We have none. So for the Abenaki here, for the Western Abenaki in this part of Indokina, NAGPRA seemed to exclude them. Another funny thing about NAGPRA, it applied to all these museums and colleges and universities, but there was one institution that was exempted, the Smithsonian. Okay? Holder of more than 18,000 sets of Native American remains was exempt from this. But that didn't stop people. And the Western Abenaki became one of the first non-federally recognized groups in the United States to request the return of their remains and actually get it to happen under NAGPRA, establishing a precedent where that sort of thing could happen. But this is a difficult and sad business in many cases. One of the saddest stories I was ever involved in, because I have worked with the Abenaki on these sorts of repatriations. But my late friend and colleague, for many years the repatriation coordinator for the Abenaki, Donna Moody, discovered that in 1873, the remains of two people, a man and a woman, had been found in Laconia, New Hampshire. And since they were Indians, okay, they were put in a museum. And then they were sold for $12 to another museum in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, where for almost 70 years they sat there as part of the collection of curios and fossils and things of that sort. And then in the 1950s, a new director came in for the museum, and she decided that she didn't want a bunch of dusty, dirty old bones. So they were deaccessioned and they were thrown in the town dump. Okay? And 10 years ago, my friend Donna, finding this out, what's to be done? Well, she did some research. She found where the dump had been in the 1950s, and she went there. She put down some tobacco and said a prayer. Working with Native people has been productive. Okay? Native people do have their own history. Sometimes it complements what we do. Sometimes it contradicts. But we've had the ability to learn from each other. Okay? The archaeologists tell a story about people coming into the Monadnock region 12 or 13,000 years ago and encountering mammoths. The Abenaki creation story says they didn't come here from somewhere else, but they were created here at the beginning of time. But in their creation stories, there is one character whose Abenaki name translates into lip-rolled-up man, who's a big, hairy, monster-like creature with this big proboscis coming out the front of his face. Sounds an awful lot like a mammoth. And there, okay, the two stories seem to coexist very nicely. And I'm hoping that that relationship continues. Working with the Abenaki will make the archaeology, it will make the history richer, more inclusive, and ultimately a lot more interesting and relevant. And one of the big revelations for me doing this sort of work is that I am not studying a past, I'm not studying a history that is dead and gone and over. I'm studying something that is still very much ongoing. So I would like to end by reading the last chapter of my book. Now, be of stout heart. It's only one page long, okay? I'd like to end by reading the last chapter, but to sort of set the scene, the book begins in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Where there are a series of really remarkable carvings on the cliff face right at the falls that were made by Native people we don't know how many years ago. And they're mostly human, sort of abstract human faces. And that's where the book begins, and it's also where the book ends. In 2008, my friend and colleague Gail Golek, who has spent years documenting archaeological sites around Bellows Falls, shared an interesting story. A local history published in 1907 recounted that many of the older residents in town remembered that up until the mid-1850s, Abenaki people still came back occasionally from Quebec to spend the summer and early fall around Bellows Falls and the surrounding area. Small groups of Abenaki would camp on either side of the river above the falls on the outskirts of town, fish, and sell baskets to local residents. This account claimed the last Native family came to the area in 1856 when an old man, his wife, and their 2 sons arrived in town. When asked why they had come, the old man said he wanted to die and be left with his ancestors. And his family set up camp along Governor's Brook in North Walpole and stayed all summer and into the fall. He died late in the fall and was buried in an unmarked grave in the Catholic cemetery in Bellows Falls, only a short distance from where those enigmatic faces carved on a rock ledge watch the water cascade southward on its way through Indakina. Were these really the last Abenaki people to come to Bellows Falls? While many town histories deny the existence of the Abenaki, the ones that don't often bring their history to an end with romantic stories of the last Indian, thereby denying their existence in the present. This fiction has been put to rest by a renaissance in the last 50 years in which Abenaki activists, elders, scholars, linguists, and artists have revitalized their culture and obliged the rest of the world to acknowledge their long presence in this region and the remarkable story of their survival. The history, archaeology, and experiences of Native people reveal ancient continuities and traditions embedded in a web of kinship and culture that spans thousands of miles. A deep presence that has somehow survived the awful trials of history in the modern age. This is the story that is worth telling and retelling, even as it continues to unfold. Thank you very much. Thank you. Over to you, Rich. Do I stay in the pulpit? And, I like this. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to teach my classes from this kind of vantage point.
Thank you, Dr. Bob Goodby, for your insightful thoughts on using archaeology to write Native American history. We now have some time for questions from the audience. For those watching virtually, you may continue to submit your questions using the chat space on YouTube. And while the ushers collect the yellow cards we spoke about, here they come. Let me begin by asking this. I get the leading question. Dr. Goodby, what, in your estimation, is the value to those of us who are here today, beyond simply curiosity, in understanding the stories of human presence here so long ago?
I think there are a couple of important things, and in a way, you could say, why is this story important at all? And yet, look at this room. It's a beautiful summer day on a Sunday morning, and look at all the people who have come here to hear this story. For some reason, this is important to folks, not just folks who have Native ancestry, but most of us here who do not. And I think there are a couple parts of that. I think one is it's important to know about the place we live, the place we call home, to know its real human history, all its complexity and beauty and ugliness, and this is part of the story. I think it's also appealing to people because, in a way, it's simultaneously both so immediate, right here under our feet, and yet in some ways it's so exotic and far away and remote. For non-Native people, it's an entirely different culture, and it can be thousands of years removed, and I think that's just sort of inherently intriguing. But I think ultimately the importance is it opens us up to the idea that we really do live in a diverse world. We live in a diverse community. It has a diverse history, and all of that has value. I'm not sure how well I did there, but...
Thank you. Uliwani. The questions are coming in here. I'll start with these in front of me. Is there archaeological evidence that the Native people in New England had contact with those in the far west?
Yeah. Archaeological evidence for those in the far west, not directly. And in terms of direct evidence of long-distance contact, that would extend out to the Midwest area, to Ohio, Illinois, when we see artifacts from those areas appearing on occasional sites particularly in Vermont, rarely in New Hampshire. That's about as far west as we get for direct evidence. But if you think about it, if the people here have connections that extend out to Ohio and Illinois, those Native people in Ohio and Illinois have connections that extend even further west than that. And what they are doing and the way their cultures are evolving are shaped by those connections, and they in turn shape the people to their east. So even if you don't have evidence of a direct connection, I think you can be open to that possibility of that very big world. And in a time before any kind of modern transportation, having connections between northern New England and the Midwest is pretty impressive all by itself.
Ulioni Mina, thank you again. Do we know how many indigenous people were here when diseases decimated the population of the Abenaki people in the 1600s?
Do we know how many Native people were here? No, we do not. We do not. There's almost no data to use to try and understand that. And again, you can take where we are in downtown Peterborough. It might have been possible at some time to study all the archaeological remains right here in this area and estimate maybe the size of a community and then extrapolate, how many people would have been in that. But that's all gone. We don't have a single site in the state of New Hampshire where we can say, okay, at the time this site was occupied, we can confidently say how many people were here at that time, never mind an overall estimate for populations. The one attempt at this, and God bless them because it wasn't easy, but in the mid-1970s, a demographer from Berkeley estimated pre-contact Native American populations in New England, and his estimate for New Hampshire was 10,000. Okay. I wouldn't take that just with a grain of salt. I'd take it with a block of salt, the kind you buy for your horses. But certainly, lower than it is today. But we really do not know.
Thank you, Bob. Another question: are there museums that you can recommend that treat this history well?
Museums that treat this history well. There are quite a few, and one of them is kitty corner to where we are right now. The Monadnock Center for History and Culture. When I came to Franklin Pierce back in 2000, one of the first connections I made was with their director, Michelle Stahl, and she reached out to me because she was redoing the lobby when you enter, and it has a timeline, a historic timeline, and she said, this needs to begin with Native Americans. Can you help me with this? And ever since then, that institution has valued and tried to include the history of Native people in all its programming. Same sort of thing with the Historical Society of Cheshire County. But a really wonderful one, if I could pick one, would be the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum in Warner. They not only have a really nice collection of traditional Abenaki material culture, but more than just a museum with a bunch of objects, they have become a cultural center for Native people, so that you can go there and you can see artists perform, you can see musicians perform, and their powwow, their summer powwow, is next weekend. And if you want to have a really enjoyable time and see the vitality of the Native community here and see some really nice material things as well, I would send you up there.
Are you going to be there?
I am thinking of going there, yes indeed. Yep.
Okay.
I'm worried if I do, they're going to draft me to be one of the volunteers. That's happened before. So.
Another question: have you recovered any evidence of Abenaki music?
I wonder if that comes from Virginia Eskin. Have we recovered any evidence for Abenaki music? Not in the archaeological record. There are a handful of sites in the Northeast where I know fragments of bone flutes have been recovered. But that's as close as we get. And that's one of those things about Abenaki culture that the archaeology is really handicapped with. Because that does not survive, it does not preserve. Our best way into that is going to be to look at contemporary Abenaki music and to trace it back. But no, as an archaeologist, I have not.
Thank you. What would it take to discover the age of the carvings in the stone walls at Bellows Falls?
That's a tricky one. Okay, how would you determine the age of those carvings at Bellows Falls? And we had the same sort of problem with the stone dam in Swansea. How do you determine the age of that dam? Our main technique for getting a real age in years in this part of the world is radiocarbon. But radiocarbon dating requires that you have organic material. It's got to be something that was alive, so it does not work on stone. We were able to date the dam by finding remains next to it, okay, on the bank of the river, remains of fireplaces with fragments of burned wood, and we're able to get a date. But those carvings are going to be hard. They are in such a scoured environment. They're right at the choke point of the falls, and they've also been brutalized by dumping of all kinds of garbage and road waste on them over the years, and there's nothing there to date them directly. I think that's going to be a tough one, and I know, Rich, you're involved in the grant that's looking into these carvings. I think probably the best way is to cast your net wide. Look at other sites in the Northeast where you have these kinds of carvings, see if there are dates that go along with some of those other sites, and maybe by extrapolation you can.
Bob. Can you speak a little bit more about what you have found at your recent look at Contoocook Lake in Jaffrey and Ringe by the college?
Yeah. What did we find when we began doing archaeological work right in this area? What we found on the face of it was not really spectacular. Right? Sort of thing that if you came to the site and I laid out our artifacts, you'd say, oh, okay. The most common thing we find, and really sort of the telltale sign that you have a native site, are the little chips of stone that are left behind from tool making. If you're making a spear point or an arrow or a knife, you've got to chip away at the piece of stone. You leave these little chips behind. They have a very distinctive form, and we found those at all of these sites. This was our first sort of entry into this. At one of the sites, we found the remains of a cooking fire. So as we're excavating, we came down, we found a concentration of burned wood or charcoal surrounded by some reddened or cracked stones, and a few artifacts right around that. We also had at that site a stone tool that stylistically we know is 3,000 to 4,000 years old. We also had some fragments of pottery that we know are about 1,000 years old, telling us that that site was occupied at least twice. But really, we're just scratching the surface at this point with those sites.
So here's a related question, and I can only do 2 or 3 more, and then we have to wind up here. Are there examples of Abenaki pottery, shards or whole pieces, that are available for viewing while we're talking about that subject?
Yeah.
Where would one see good examples?
If I were looking at some of the native pottery from this area, there are 2 places I would go. One is the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum. They have a couple very nice pieces on display. But the other is the Millyard Museum of the Manchester Historic Association in Manchester. They have an immense collection of artifacts from right around Amoskeag Falls, including some really beautifully decorated pottery, some mostly reconstructed pots. So that is, I think, where I'd direct people.
Here's a good leading question.
Okay.
Where do you dream of your next digs in the Monadnock region?
Where would I like to dig in the Monadnock region? In all honesty, and this is one of the things I love about archaeology, the best sites I've worked on are just ones I stumble on. I didn't plan on digging behind the middle school site in Keene and finding an almost 13,000-year-old site. I was hired to do it because they needed a federal permit, and lo and behold, I've got a wonderful project. That's the way a lot of my stuff happens. But as I was getting ready for this talk, and I was looking at aerial photographs and maps of downtown Peterborough, and thinking, because I started off on sort of a downer. There's this remarkable site here, and it's all gone. It's all been destroyed. But I don't know that for a fact. And as I was looking at those aerial photos, I was wondering, what about this area? Could there be something intact there? Or what about over here? My second summer in archaeology, I actually spent working in the heart of urban Manchester on a remnant of a remarkable site that had 6 feet of deposits, and it was wedged in between 2 highways and 2 gas stations. Okay? Have we got something like this right here in downtown Peterborough? I think that would be really wonderful to find and to take a look at, and to sort of bring that history right back here. So, yeah.
Can I come?
What do you think? Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And one last question, from your view as an archaeologist and looking forward, how do you believe those living in the Monadnock region can and should acknowledge Native American history of the region?
Yeah. How do we acknowledge the Native history here? I think there are a number of ways that you can do that. I think it certainly has got to begin with talking with Native people about how they think that acknowledgement should take place, and involving them in that process, and that's something that's happening. One of the really remarkable trends, because this wasn't happening 5 years ago, there has been a real move toward having recognition or acknowledgement statements by different institutions who have, on a plaque by their entrance or at the start of a talk, they'll have a statement that says, we just want to acknowledge, and I'll just make up my own here, we just want to acknowledge that we are in Indakina, the traditional home of the Western Abenaki people. I think those things are important because it brings that history to light. It doesn't permit that invisibility that's been imposed on Native people, and it makes people think, okay, not only about the depth of the history, but what happened to the Native populations that were here? What were the details of that history? And this, I don't know if this is pushing the analogy too far, but I was really struck a few years ago. My wife and I went to Europe, and in some of the cobblestone streets of the cities we were visiting, among the cobblestones there'd be a little round piece of brass, and etched on the brass was the name of the Jewish family that had lived in that house, okay, before the Holocaust. And it was subtle, but it was there. It wasn't going to let that history sort of go away. And I think those are good things. But I also think the acknowledgement is not just about the past. It's not just bad things happened in the past, and let's be honest about it. But I think it's acknowledging that there are Abenaki people in our community today, and making space for them, and making space for their history. Because let's make no mistake about it, these acknowledgement statements are very nice, but none of that land is going to be given back. Okay? There are other sorts of things that we have to look for, and the way to do that is through collaboration with Native people.
Uliwani, niwadsi indi dam bena asqua no di bena yodali. And that's why we say we are still here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, folks.
So I want to say thank you, Professor Goodby, for sharing your time and expertise with us. We hope you have enjoyed today's live broadcast of the Monadnock Summer Lyceum. Thank you for your support of our 2022 season. Please join us in 2 weeks on the 17th of July to hear Tom Wessels, another good friend, talking about coevolution, the model for humanity's sustainable future. Now, please join us for an informal reception in the parish hall through the door to my right. There you will have the opportunity to engage in further conversation with our speaker and to enjoy cold drinks. Please respect social distancing when approaching our bookseller, and our speaker, Bob, will be signing copies of his new book. Uliwuni, thank you.